Most people believe that shame is simply an emotion, a painful feeling that appears when someone criticizes, mocks, or humiliates them. But if you study history, politics, business, and human relationships closely, you begin to notice something deeper. Shame is rarely accidental. It is one of the oldest psychological weapons ever created. Long before people fought with armies, they fought for status. Long before physical battles, there were social battles. And in every social battle, the fastest way to weaken another person was not necessarily to hurt their body, it was to make them doubt their worth. The moment you begin to understand this, something changes inside you. You stop asking, "Why are they treating me this way?" and begin asking a far more powerful question, "What are they trying to gain?" That question shifts the entire game. People who shame others often disguise their intentions behind honesty, humor, or criticism. They may tell you they're just joking. They may insist they're only telling the truth. They may even convince everyone around them that they're trying to help you improve. But beneath these explanations is often a desire for something far less noble. They want influence. They want superiority. They want to establish themselves higher in the invisible hierarchy that governs every social interaction. Human beings are deeply sensitive to status because, for thousands of years, survival depended on belonging to the group. Rejection from the tribe once meant death. That ancient instinct still lives inside us today. When someone publicly embarrasses you, criticizes you unfairly, or makes you feel insignificant, your nervous system reacts as though your place in the tribe is under attack. This is why shame feels so overwhelming. It isn't simply emotional pain. It is an ancient survival alarm. Those who understand this instinct can manipulate it. Notice how certain people always seem to point out your mistakes in front of others rather than in private. Notice how they interrupt you, laugh at your ideas, compare you to someone more successful, or constantly remind you of your past failures. They're not correcting you, they're positioning themselves above you. The tragedy is that most people never recognize the strategy. Instead, they begin believing the accusations. They replay the insults over and over in their minds until the voice of the manipulator becomes their own inner voice. That is the real victory of the person who shames you. The humiliation itself lasts only a moment, but if you accept it as part of your identity, it can control your decisions for years. Think about how many brilliant people stopped speaking because someone laughed at their first attempt. How many entrepreneurs abandoned an idea because relatives mocked them? How many artists hid their work because they feared criticism? The greatest prison is not built with walls. It is built with the opinions you decide to carry. This is why your first responsibility is not proving your critics wrong. It is refusing to let them define who you are. Remember something that successful people eventually discover. People often attack what they secretly fear. Confidence threatens the insecure. Discipline exposes the lazy. Ambition reminds comfortable people of the dreams they abandoned. Not every insult comes from wisdom. Many come from projection. The insecure person wants company in insecurity. The fearful person wants others to remain afraid. The person who lacks purpose becomes uncomfortable when standing beside someone who has one. Once you understand projection, you stop personalizing every attack. You begin observing instead of absorbing. This doesn't mean every criticism should be ignored. Genuine criticism can become one of your greatest teachers. Wise people know how to separate useful feedback from emotional manipulation. Constructive criticism focuses on your actions. Destructive shaming attacks your identity. One says, "This decision could have been better." The other says, "You are a failure." One helps you grow. The other wants you to shrink. Learning to recognize the difference is one of the most valuable psychological skills you can develop. Pay attention to patterns. Does this person encourage you when you improve? Or do they become even more critical as you become more successful? Do they offer solutions? Or do they only point out flaws? Are they invested in your growth or in maintaining control over your confidence? These questions reveal motives more clearly than words ever can. Another truth is equally important. The people who are easiest to shame are those whose identity depends entirely on external approval. If your confidence is borrowed from compliments, it can be stolen by insults. If your self-worth depends on applause, silence will feel unbearable. Real confidence is different. It is built privately, long before anyone else notices. It comes from keeping promises to yourself, developing competence, facing discomfort voluntarily, and knowing your value so clearly that other people's opinions become information rather than commands. This kind of confidence cannot be manufactured overnight. It is built through repeated acts of self-respect. Every disciplined morning, every difficult conversation, every promise kept, every challenge faced without running away. These quiet victories become psychological armor. Then something remarkable happens. When someone attempts to shame you, the attack no longer finds an empty space inside you. Their words collide with a foundation you've built through action rather than validation. The insult loses its destination. That is why the strongest people rarely appear desperate to defend themselves. They have already settled the argument internally. They know who they are. They understand their strengths, acknowledge their weaknesses, and continue improving without needing permission from anyone else. And when you reach that point, something almost paradoxical occurs. The people who once tried to make you feel small begin losing their influence, not because they changed, but because you stopped participating in their psychological game. You no longer chase approval. You no longer fear rejection. You no longer mistake someone else's opinion for your identity. That is the beginning of real freedom, because the moment you recognize shame as a strategy instead of a truth, you reclaim the power that was quietly being taken from you. And once you refuse to carry another person's judgment as your own, you become impossible to control. Never forget this. People can only shame the version of you that still believes they have the authority to define your worth. Now, once you recognize that shame is often used as a weapon rather than an honest evaluation of your character, the next question becomes far more important. How do you respond? This is where most people lose the battle they could have easily won. The natural instinct is to react. Someone insults you, and your heart begins to race. Your mind searches for the perfect comeback. You feel an overwhelming urge to defend yourself, explain your intentions, or prove that they're wrong. It feels justified. It feels necessary. But psychologically, this is exactly the response your opponent is hoping for. When someone tries to shame you, they are not simply looking for a reaction, they are looking for control. The moment they can dictate your emotional state, they have already influenced your behavior. Your attention shifts away from your own purpose and toward managing their opinion. In that instant, they become the center of your mental world. Power always follows attention. This is why emotionally disciplined people are so difficult to manipulate. They refuse to surrender their attention to every insult, accusation, or provocation. They understand that not every battle deserves participation. In fact, some battles are designed so that the moment you enter them, you have already lost. Consider how often people destroy their own reputation by trying too hard to protect it. One accusation leads to endless explanations. One sarcastic remark turns into an emotional argument. One attempt to embarrass them becomes a public spectacle because they refuse to let it go. Ironically, the more desperately they fight to erase the insult, the more attention they bring to it. There is a profound psychological principle at work here. What you resist emotionally often gains strength over you. What you calmly observe begins to lose its influence. This does not mean becoming passive. It does not mean allowing others to disrespect you without limits. Emotional control is not weakness, it is delayed strength. It is choosing your response instead of surrendering it to someone else's behavior. History repeatedly shows us that the most influential leaders, negotiators, and strategists possessed one quality above all else: composure under pressure. They understood that emotions are valuable servants but dangerous masters. Anger can reveal injustice, but uncontrolled anger reveals vulnerability. Fear can warn you of danger, but panic hands your enemy the advantage. When someone shames you publicly, they are often counting on your emotions to finish the job they started. Imagine someone insulting you during a meeting, in front of friends, or on social media. Most people immediately defend themselves. They speak faster, their voice changes, they begin explaining details nobody asked for. They hope logic will erase humiliation. But human psychology rarely works that way. The audience does not only evaluate your words, they evaluate your emotional state. If you appear desperate, defensive, or unstable, many will unconsciously associate those emotions with weakness, regardless of whether your argument is correct. This is why silence can become one of the most misunderstood forms of strength. Silence is not surrender. Silence is observation. It creates uncertainty in the mind of the aggressor. They expect resistance. They expect anger. They expect excuses. Instead, they encounter stillness. That stillness forces them to question themselves. Have they gone too far? Did their attack fail? Why isn't this person reacting? Suddenly, the emotional pressure begins shifting away from you and back toward them. People are remarkably uncomfortable when their attempts to provoke someone produce nothing. Manipulators survive on predictable reactions. Deny them those reactions, and much of their influence disappears. This is why emotional discipline requires patience. Not every response needs to be immediate. In many situations, time itself becomes an ally. The emotional intensity that feels overwhelming today often appears insignificant tomorrow. Decisions made in calmness are usually wiser than decisions made in outrage. Ask yourself a simple question whenever someone attempts to shame you: will this matter 1 year from now? If the answer is no, perhaps it deserves far less emotional energy than you're about to give it. Another useful question is even more powerful. Am I responding to protect my values or to protect my ego? The ego wants immediate victory. Wisdom seeks long-term strength. There is an enormous difference between defending your dignity and defending your pride. Pride demands that every insult be answered. Dignity understands that some people are not worthy of your explanation. Not everyone deserves access to your emotional world. Think about individuals who constantly criticize others. They often move from one target to another because conflict gives them significance. If you become emotionally entangled with them, you unknowingly provide exactly what they were seeking: your time, your attention, and your peace of mind. The most effective way to weaken this pattern is not through louder arguments, but through emotional independence. Emotional independence means your mood is no longer determined by another person's approval or disapproval. It means compliments no longer inflate your ego, and insults no longer define your identity. You begin living according to principles rather than reactions. This is not an easy discipline. It requires daily practice. You train yourself to pause before speaking. You observe your emotions without obeying them. You replace impulsive reactions with deliberate choices. Over time, this changes more than your behavior. It changes how people perceive you. Calmness has a unique psychological effect. People naturally associate composure with confidence. They assume that someone who remains steady under pressure possesses inner certainty. Whether in business, leadership, relationships, or everyday life, the person who governs themselves often influences those around them without raising their voice. Remember, strength is rarely loud. A mountain does not announce its stability. The ocean does not argue with every wave. Likewise, a disciplined mind does not chase every insult demanding an answer. Of course, there will be moments when a response is necessary. Boundaries matter. Injustice should not always be ignored. But even then, the strongest response is measured rather than emotional. Speak with clarity, not rage. Set limits without surrendering your self-control. Let your words come from intention instead of impulse. When people realize they cannot manipulate your emotions, they often lose interest in trying. They discover that the old methods no longer work. The buttons they once pushed have disappeared because you have removed them yourself. That is the essence of psychological freedom. No one controls the person who controls themselves. And as you continue this journey, you'll discover something extraordinary. Emotional mastery is not about suppressing your feelings. It is about refusing to let your feelings become someone else's weapon. The calmer your mind becomes, the harder you are to intimidate, the harder you are to shame, and the harder you are to defeat. So the next time someone tries to provoke you, remember this simple truth. Asterisk, asterisk, your greatest victory is not proving them wrong. It is proving that your peace is no longer theirs to control. Asterisk, asterisk, now we've arrived at the final stage of this transformation. First, you learn to recognize shame for what it truly is, not an objective judgment, but often a strategy designed to influence your behavior. Then you discovered that emotional control is the strongest defense because the person who governs their own emotions cannot easily be manipulated by someone else's intentions. But there is one level beyond defense, one level where you stop merely surviving psychological attacks and begin rendering them powerless. That level is becoming so valuable, so grounded in your own purpose, that another person's attempt to shame you no longer determines the direction of your life. This is where most people misunderstand revenge. They imagine revenge as retaliation. They picture humiliating the person who humiliated them, winning an argument, exposing their flaws, or making them regret their actions. For a brief moment, these victories can feel satisfying, but they are temporary because they still keep your attention fixed on the very person who tried to diminish you. Real power works differently. The strongest people don't build their lives around defeating their critics. They build lives so meaningful that their critics gradually become irrelevant. This is one of the greatest psychological shifts you can make. The moment your purpose becomes larger than your pride, your energy begins flowing toward creation instead of reaction. Think about how much potential is wasted every day because people are obsessed with proving themselves. They spend years trying to convince family members who never believed in them. They argue endlessly with strangers online. They replay conversations in their minds, imagining the perfect response they should have given months ago. They postpone their own growth because they are emotionally attached to someone else's opinion. Meanwhile, time continues moving forward. The people who accomplish extraordinary things rarely have unlimited confidence in the beginning. What separates them is not the absence of criticism, it is the decision to keep moving despite it. Every meaningful achievement attracts resistance. If you pursue excellence, someone will call you arrogant. If you become disciplined, someone will accuse you of changing. If you refuse to follow the crowd, someone will label you difficult. If you become successful, someone will insist you were simply lucky. This is the price of growth. The mistake is believing that universal approval is possible. It isn't. The philosopher who challenged accepted beliefs was criticized. The inventor who introduced a revolutionary idea was doubted. The artist who created something original was misunderstood. History repeatedly reminds us that society often resists those who refuse to remain ordinary. Once you accept this reality, criticism stops becoming a sign that you're failing. Sometimes it becomes evidence that you're moving beyond people's expectations. But acceptance alone is not enough. You must transform emotional pain into disciplined action. Every insult can become fuel. Every rejection can become preparation. Every attempt to make you feel small can become a reminder to strengthen your character rather than weaken your confidence. Imagine two people receiving the exact same humiliation. The first spends months replaying the event, seeking sympathy, waiting for an apology that never comes. The second quietly begins learning, improving, exercising, reading, building skills, developing emotional discipline, and expanding their competence. Years later, both people are living with the consequences of the same moment. One allowed shame to become an identity. The other allowed it to become motivation. The difference was never the insult. The difference was the interpretation. This is why discipline is such a powerful form of psychological resistance. Discipline gives you evidence that cannot be argued away. No one can debate the hours you invested. No one can erase the habits you developed. No one can take away the wisdom earned through consistent effort. Confidence built on appearance, popularity, or approval is fragile because it depends on circumstances. Confidence built on competence becomes remarkably difficult to destroy. When you know you've done the work, criticism loses much of its emotional weight. There is another lesson that deserves attention. Many people spend their lives trying to change the opinions of others. Very few invest the same energy into changing themselves, yet your influence over yourself is infinitely greater than your influence over anyone else's thinking. You cannot force respect. You can become respectable. You cannot demand admiration. You can become admirable. You cannot control whether people misunderstand you. You can control whether you continue becoming the person you were meant to become. That distinction changes everything. There will always be individuals who refuse to acknowledge your growth because accepting it would require confronting their own limitations. Some people become emotionally invested in the older version of you because it allows them to feel comfortable about remaining the same. Do not expect everyone to celebrate your transformation. Some relationships exist only as long as you remain small enough to preserve another person's comfort. When you outgrow those expectations, resistance often follows. Let it. Growth has always required leaving behind environments that reward mediocrity. Another important truth is this: stop measuring your worth by the volume of applause you receive. The crowd is inconsistent. Today they praise you, tomorrow they criticize you. The same voices that celebrate success can disappear the moment circumstances change. If your identity depends on public approval, your peace will constantly rise and fall with opinions you cannot control. Instead, build your identity around principles. Ask yourself each evening, did I become wiser today? Did I keep my word? Did I improve my character? Did I move closer to my purpose? Those questions create a kind of confidence that cannot be borrowed or stolen. Eventually, something remarkable happens. The people who once tried to shame you begin noticing that their words no longer produce the same effect. You no longer rush to defend yourself. You no longer seek their validation. You no longer organize your life around proving them wrong. You simply continue building. That quiet consistency becomes more persuasive than any argument. Success has a language that requires very few words. Character has a presence that cannot be imitated. Inner peace has a strength that no insult can easily penetrate. And perhaps this is the greatest irony of all. The person who once tried to make you feel powerless eventually loses influence, not because you defeated them in a dramatic confrontation, but because you stopped giving them authority over your mind. That is genuine freedom, not the freedom to avoid criticism, because that is impossible, not the freedom to control other people's opinions, because that is an illusion, but the freedom to remain fully committed to your purpose, regardless of what others choose to think. In the end, your greatest response to shame is not revenge. It is transformation. It is becoming someone whose confidence is earned, whose character is disciplined, and whose direction is no longer controlled by the judgments of others. So leave today with this thought. The people who try to shame you can only delay your future if you spend your life looking back at them. Turn your eyes toward your purpose and let your growth become the only answer they never saw coming.